8 years of war killed 1 million people, and most of the world never noticed. Not because it was hidden, not because it was small, because no one decided it mattered enough to remember. The Iran-Iraq War was the longest conventional war of the 20th century. It involved chemical weapons used on a scale not seen since the First World War. It sent children across minefields to clear the way for soldiers. It ended without a single border change. Every death was, in the coldest possible strategic accounting, for nothing. That fact alone makes this one of the most devastating and underreported military stories in modern history. The war began on the 22nd of September, 1980. It ended on the 20th of August, 1988. Between those two dates, somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people died, soldiers and civilians, young men and younger boys, women in villages that never had names in any foreign newspaper. The official numbers were low. The real numbers, most historians now agree, were higher. No one wanted to know by how much. In the West, this war has no monument. It has no memorial film. It has no museum. It does not appear in most school curricula, yet it shaped everything that came after it. The Persian Gulf crisis of 1990, the weapons programs that became pretexts for the next war, the regional power balance that still governs the Middle East today, all of it traces back to 8 years that the world forgot before they were over. This is the story of the Iran-Iraq War, and the story is stranger, darker, and more important than almost anyone knows. To understand how this war began, it is necessary to understand the two countries that fought it, not as nations on a map, as places where people lived. Iraq in 1980 was a state held together by oil money and terror. Saddam Hussein had consolidated total power in July of 1979. Within weeks of taking full control, he had summoned the leadership of the ruling Ba'ath Party to a meeting in Baghdad. A list of names was read aloud. Men were led from the room. Those who remained were handed weapons and told to execute the men who had just left. By the time it was over, 68 senior officials had been killed. This was how Saddam Hussein announced that he was in charge. He was, by any measure, a leader who had never felt fear from anyone close to him. That certainty would cost him everything. Iraq had a professional army, Soviet-supplied armor, a functioning air force, and one of the largest defense budgets in the Arab world. It also had a Shia Muslim majority that Saddam Hussein, a Sunni, had suppressed with consistent brutality. He watched what happened next door with something close to alarm. Iran in 1979 had undergone a revolution that shook the political foundations of the entire region. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, had been overthrown after decades of American-backed authoritarian rule. In his place came Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a cleric who had been in exile for 15 years. Khomeini's revolution was not simply political. It was theological. It declared that the rule of Islamic law was the only legitimate form of government. It called on Muslim populations everywhere to rise against their secular rulers. Saddam Hussein heard that message and understood exactly who it was directed at: his own Shia majority, his own legitimacy. Iran's military in 1980 was in chaos. The revolution had gutted the officer corps. Hundreds of experienced commanders had been executed or imprisoned on suspicion of loyalty to the Shah. Weapon systems purchased from the United States were no longer receiving spare parts. Morale among regular troops was uncertain. Saddam saw a window. He believed it would stay open for 6 weeks. He was wrong. There was at that moment a young soldier in the Iraqi army named Majid. He was 20 years old. He had been conscripted the year before. He kept a letter from his mother folded inside his boot. He believed, because everyone told him to believe, that the war would be short. By the autumn of 1980, two countries were preparing to fight a war that neither could afford and neither could abandon. Iraq held what appeared to be every advantage. Its army numbered approximately 190,000 soldiers at the start of the conflict. It had 2,000 Soviet-built tanks. It had a functional air force with modern Soviet and French aircraft. It controlled the border terrain, and it was moving first. The Iraqi plan, developed with genuine strategic logic, was to strike Iran while its military was still in disarray. The objective was the Shatt al-Arab waterway, the disputed river border between the two countries and the oil-rich, ethnically Arab province of Khuzestan in southwestern Iran. Saddam Hussein believed the Arab population of Khuzestan would welcome the Iraqi army as liberators. He dismissed the intelligence reports suggesting otherwise. He had not asked for those reports. He did not want them. Iran's military on paper looked broken. In practice, the picture was more complicated. What the revolutionary government had done to the professional officer class, it had done deliberately. Khomeini did not trust men trained by the Shah. He trusted men who had proven loyalty to the revolution. In place of the old army structure, Iran had built the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Sepah, a parallel military force whose primary loyalty was theological, not institutional. By 1980, the Sepah numbered perhaps 80,000 men. They were not well trained, they were not well equipped, but they were willing to die in a way that professional soldiers sometimes are not. This distinction would define the first 3 years of the war. Iran also had an asset that defied conventional military calculation. It had population. Iran's population in 1980 was approximately 38 million people. Iraq's was approximately 13 million. When Iran ran out of trained soldiers, it would reach into the population, again and again and again. The decision that most haunts this war, the one that historians still struggle to account for, was made in Tehran, not Baghdad. It was made by men who believed that dying in a holy war guaranteed paradise, and who therefore did not calculate casualties the way military planners in other countries did. The human wave attack was not a tactic born of desperation. It was, in the minds of those who ordered it, an act of religious faith. Thousands of young men and boys would be sent across open ground toward Iraqi defensive lines. They would clear the minefields with their feet. The soldiers behind them would advance. This is that strategy written plainly. There is no gentle way to write it. There was no gentle way to execute it. They built a military philosophy on the willingness to spend human lives. That was the accounting, and the terrible logic of it was that it worked for a time. What they had was numbers, and numbers in that kind of war meant boys. The attack began before dawn on the 22nd of September, 1980. Iraqi aircraft struck 10 Iranian air bases simultaneously. The logic was sound. Destroy Iran's air force on the ground, as Israel had destroyed Egypt's air force in June of 1967. The execution was not sound. Iranian aircraft were dispersed. Iranian air defenses were more functional than Iraqi intelligence had reported. The strike destroyed some aircraft. It did not destroy the Iranian Air Force. Within 24 hours, Iranian jets were conducting retaliatory strikes on Iraqi cities. This was the first signal that the 6-week war Saddam had planned would not be a 6-week war. On the ground, Iraqi armored divisions crossed the border along a 400-kilometer front. They advanced. They captured territory. But they advanced slowly, too slowly. The Iraqi commander's approach was methodical, where the plan had called for speed. Cities that should have fallen in days were besieged for weeks. Khorramshahr, the port city in Khuzestan, was supposed to fall in a matter of days. It did not fall for 34 days. The fighting was house to house, street to street, door to door. The Iranians defending it were not the professional military. They were volunteers, Revolutionary Guard fighters, ordinary citizens who had picked up weapons. The Iraqis eventually took the city, but by the time they held it, they had paid a price in casualties that had not been calculated into the plan. The Iranians called Khorramshahr the City of Blood. The name stayed. In Baghdad, Saddam Hussein watched the reports arrive and began to understand that this was not the war he had planned. He ordered his generals to consolidate the gains and hold the territory. He did not understand that consolidating in a war against an enemy willing to die indefinitely was not a viable strategy. He was waiting for Iran to break. Iran was not going to break. International world in these early weeks made a calculation of its own. The United States had not forgotten the hostage crisis. 52 American diplomats had been held in Tehran for 444 days. They had been released just as Ronald Reagan took office on the 20th of January, 1981. The Reagan administration made a quiet determination. Iran was the enemy. Iraq, whatever its government, was preferable. This meant that when Saddam Hussein needed intelligence about Iranian troop positions, he would receive it. It meant that when he needed agricultural credits to free up other funds for military spending, he would receive those too. And it meant that when his forces began using chemical weapons, the United States would look away. That decision was made in Washington before the worst of what was coming had even begun. But there is a part of this story that almost no one knows, and it changes the meaning of everything that came before it. The weapons that would be used to kill Kurdish civilians in the worst chemical attack since the First World War. Many of the precursor chemicals used to manufacture them were sold to Iraq by Western companies with the knowledge of Western governments. That is not speculation. That is documented. And the story of how that knowledge was buried is stranger than anything that happened on any battlefield. The war found its rhythm in the autumn of 1981. Iraq held a strip of Iranian territory, roughly 8,000 square kilometers in size. It was not enough territory to force a peace. It was too much to surrender without losing face. Iran had spent the first year rebuilding its military capacity under conditions of revolutionary chaos. Officers who had been imprisoned were quietly released and returned to their posts. The Sepah, the Revolutionary Guard, had been integrated more closely with the regular army. And Khomeini had made a decision that would define the next 6 years. Iran would not accept a ceasefire, not because a ceasefire was unavailable. One was offered. Khomeini rejected it. His stated condition was the removal of Saddam Hussein. His deeper intention was the export of the revolution. A war against Saddam Hussein was not simply a border dispute. It was a war against the principle of secular Arab nationalism. It was a war that, if won, would leave Iran as the dominant power in the Persian Gulf. In the spring of 1982, Iran launched a series of major offensives that reversed the entire first phase of the war. Operation Undeniable Victory, launched on the 22nd of March 1982, was the largest Iranian offensive to that point. 100,000 Iranian troops struck the Iraqi lines across a wide front in Khuzestan. The Iraqi 7th Division was torn apart. 15,000 Iraqi soldiers were captured in 3 days. The Iraqi lines did not hold. They collapsed. Khorramshahr, the city Iraq had bled to take, was recaptured by Iran in May of 1982. 20,000 Iraqi soldiers were captured in the operation to retake it. Saddam Hussein, for the first time, offered a unilateral ceasefire and withdrew his forces from most of the Iranian territory he had taken. Iran refused. This refusal was the moment the nature of the war changed completely. Iraq was now on the defensive. Iran was advancing toward Baghdad. The question was no longer whether Iraq would take Iranian territory. The question was whether Iraq would survive. Somewhere on those retreating Iraqi lines was a soldier named Majid. He had kept his mother's letter through 2 years of war. The letter was worn through at the folds now. He could no longer read every word. He still knew what it said. Remember the number from the opening of this story. We are now roughly 2 years into the 8 years that produced it. Not one of those deaths has happened yet. The worst is still ahead. In July of 1982, Iran launched Operation Ramadan. It was the first major Iranian attempt to cross into Iraqi territory. The target was Basra, Iraq's second largest city, its major port, its symbolic gateway to the Persian Gulf. If Basra fell, Iraq fell. The force Iran committed was enormous, between 80,000 and 100,000 troops. And among them, for the first time in the open, were the Basij. The Basij were volunteers. Many of them were very young. Some accounts place the youngest at 12 years old. Others say 13. The recruitment was not hidden. The revolutionary government issued plastic keys, gold-painted plastic keys, to boys who volunteered for the Basij. The keys, they were told, would open the gates of paradise. Boys wore them around their necks. They walked into minefields wearing them. This is not an accusation. This is testimony from survivors who were there. The tactic had a name in military analysis. It was called the human wave. The first wave entered the minefield. The first wave died. The mines were cleared. The second wave advanced. Operation Ramadan failed to take Basra. It lasted 9 days. Iranian casualties are estimated at between 50,000 and 80,000 in that single operation. 9 days. Those numbers are not misprints. Iraq held. But holding was not the same as winning. Over the next 3 years, Iran launched offensive after offensive against the Iraqi lines around Basra. The names of the operations were religious. Dawn 1, Dawn 2, Dawn 3, Dawn 4. Each one sent thousands of young Iranians into the Iraqi defensive lines. Each one failed to break through. Each one killed in the tens of thousands. Iraq's defense of its own territory had forced it into a strategy of its own. It built defensive lines of extraordinary depth, earthworks, berms, tank traps, wire. It flooded lowland areas to slow the human wave advances. And increasingly, it used chemical weapons. The first confirmed use of Iraqi chemical weapons against Iranian troops was in 1983. By 1985, chemical attacks were routine. Mustard gas, nerve agents, taboon, sarin. The gas masks that were supposed to protect Iranian soldiers had been designed for different agents entirely. No one had updated the specifications. The soldiers who died from gas attacks often did not know what had killed them. Two governments had decided, separately and for entirely different reasons, that this war was worth fighting indefinitely. One had decided that God was on its side. The other had decided that survival was worth any cost. Both were right about one thing. They were right that the other side would not stop. And that truth, shared by both, was what made 1 million deaths possible. Somewhere in an Iranian town that will not be named here, there was a classroom that had stopped receiving students. 3 boys from the same street had volunteered for the Basij. None of them came back. Their teacher had written the date on the board the morning they left. The date stayed there for a long time. Nobody wanted to erase it. By 1986, the war had been running for 6 years. It had consumed approximately $300 billion in direct military expenditure. It had produced no territorial change of consequence. No diplomatic resolution was visible. No outside power was seriously attempting to end it. The United Nations Security Council had passed resolutions calling for a ceasefire. Iraq and Iran had ignored them. The United States was not pressing for a ceasefire because a ceasefire would require it to publicly engage with a government it had publicly humiliated during the hostage crisis. The Soviet Union was supplying both sides Iraq directly, Iran indirectly through intermediaries. The logic was a cold one. A prolonged war between 2 regional powers served everyone who wanted neither power to dominate the Persian Gulf. This was the calculation, and it was made by men sitting in offices very far from the Shah al-Arab. In February of 1986, Iran achieved what all the human wave attacks had failed to achieve. A highly trained unit of Revolutionary Guards crossed the Shah al-Arab in small boats at night and captured the Fa Peninsula, a critical piece of Iraqi territory at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. It took 36 hours. It shocked the Iraqi military. For the first time, Saddam Hussein faced the real possibility that Iraq might lose this war. He reached for the chemical weapons again. Not at the front, not against Iranian soldiers. He turned them toward his own population. In March of 1988, Iraqi aircraft attacked the Kurdish town of Halabja. The order came through in the early morning. The commander read it once. He did not read it again. The men around him understood what it meant before he said a word. By the time the sun was fully up, the streets of Halabja had gone quiet. Not the quiet of a battle. the quiet of a place where people live. That noise was simply gone. The attack used mustard gas and nerve agents simultaneously. The town's population was between 46,000 and 50,000 people. The death toll from the attack is estimated at between 3,200 and 5,000 people, most of them civilians, women, children, elderly men who could not run. The images taken by a photographer who entered the town days later, bodies in the street, a father curled around an infant, a hand reaching upward from a doorway, circulated briefly in international press. Then they stopped circulating. What happened at Halabja did not stay in that valley. It traveled. The impunity with which Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons against his own population was a lesson he remembered. It was a lesson the world taught him by watching and doing nothing. When the next crisis came, he already knew what he could get away with. You have felt the consequences of that lesson without knowing its name. By the summer of 1988, Iran was exhausted, not ideologically, physically. The Basij were running out of volunteers. The Revolutionary Guard had taken losses that the official figures refused to acknowledge. Morale in the regular army was collapsing quietly. Iran's economy was broken. Oil revenues, essential for funding the war, had fallen catastrophically as oil prices dropped globally in the mid-1980s. Inflation was high, shortages were widespread, the population was tired. Iraq, in contrast, had entered a new phase, rearmed, restocked, receiving fresh intelligence from American satellites on Iranian troop positions. In April of 1988, Iraq launched Operation Blessed Ramadan. It retook the Fa Peninsula in 35 hours. The same operation Iran had taken 36 hours to win Iraq reversed it in 35. In May, in June, in July, Iraq attacked. The Iranians fell back. They fell back everywhere, quickly, without the resistance of previous years. Something had broken, not a line, a will. Iraq had also, in these final months, begun attacking Iranian cities with ballistic missiles. Soviet-supplied Scud missiles, modified to extend their range. Tehran was hit, repeatedly. The missile attacks killed civilians. They had a specific purpose beyond the casualties. They were designed to show the Iranian population that the war had come home, that the cost of Khomeini's refusal to accept a ceasefire was not paid only on the front. It was paid here, in this street, at this window. On the 18th of July, 1988, Iran announced its acceptance of United Nations Security Council Resolution 598, ceasefire resolution that had been on the table since July of 1987. Khomeini announced the acceptance in a statement that contained one of the most remarkable sentences any head of state has ever issued. He said accepting the ceasefire was, for him, more deadly than taking poison. He compared it to drinking a cup of poison. He said he was doing it for the survival of the revolution. The poison language was not metaphor. He meant it. 4 weeks later, on the 20th of August, 1988, the guns stopped. They had fought for 8 years to preserve a border that had existed before the war. That was the accounting. The line on the map was exactly where it had been on the 22nd of September, 1980. No one wanted to say that out loud. Both governments had reasons not to. They never did. Silence, stopped, gone. There is no final agreed figure for how many people died in the Iran-Iraq War. Iran has never published official military casualty figures. Iraq's figures under Saddam Hussein were controlled by the state. Independent estimates range from 500,000 to 1 million dead. The most credible scholarly estimates place total deaths, military and civilian, on both sides at approximately 500,000 to 600,000. But the wounded were far more numerous. Iran alone acknowledged more than 400,000 veterans bearing permanent injuries, chemical injuries, lost limbs, burned lungs from gas exposure that would kill those men slowly over the years that followed. The boys who had been sent across minefields wearing plastic keys, some of them survived. They came home to a country that had decided not to speak about what they had done or what had been done to them. Among the Iraqi dead was a young man whose story began in this script. Majid had survived the retreat of 1982. He had survived the defensive years along the Basra front. He had survived the missile strikes on his position and the gas attacks that killed men standing beside him. He did not survive the final Iraqi offensives of 1988. The letter his mother had written him was still in his boot when his body was recovered. It was unreadable by then. The folds had worn entirely through, but the handwriting was still visible in places, not readable. Still visible. His family received a notification and nothing more. No medal, no ceremony. Saddam Hussein was not holding ceremonies for dead soldiers. Dead soldiers were a number no one was meant to discuss. There were hundreds of thousands of Majids in Iran, in Iraq. The grief that was never expressed publicly had to go somewhere. It went inside, where it remains. In a town in southwestern Iran, there is a school that was built after the war to replace one destroyed by bombing. The new school opened years after the ceasefire. The teachers noticed in the first years that some of the children never asked about their fathers, not because they had forgotten, because they had learned, somehow, that asking was a thing that caused pain in adults. And so they didn't ask. They learned to live inside that silence, the way children do, the way people do. Still. Ceasefire on the 20th of August, 1988, brought silence to the front lines. It brought nothing else. There was no peace treaty. There was no agreement on the fundamental dispute, the Shatt al-Arab waterway, that had been Iraq's stated reason for going to war. Prisoners of war remained in captivity for years after the fighting stopped. Some Iranian prisoners were not returned until the 1990s. Some Iraqi prisoners held by Iran were not fully accounted for until even later. The infrastructure of both countries, refineries, ports, bridges, hospitals, schools had been severely damaged. Iraq's external debt, accumulated to finance the war, was enormous, more than $80 billion. Much of it owed to Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, which had financed Iraq as a buffer against Iranian revolutionary expansion. The Fars Peninsula, fought over twice in the final years of the war, is still marked by the debris of that conflict. Unexploded ordnance remains in the soil of areas that were contested ground. The Shatt al-Arab waterway, which both countries had fought over for 8 years, was heavily damaged and silted from the fighting. It remained closed to shipping for years after the ceasefire. In Halabja, the town struck by chemical weapons, in March of 1988, a memorial now stands. It was built decades after the attack. The photographs taken in those first days of bodies in the streets, of the particular stillness of a town where everything stopped at once, are preserved in archives. What the Iran-Iraq War produced, in terms of ideas and precedents, is more consequential than its territorial outcomes. It produced the demonstrated precedent that chemical weapons could be used against a civilian population, and that the international community, if it had strategic reasons to stay quiet, would stay quiet. It produced a Saddam Hussein who had survived 8 years of existential war and drawn a specific conclusion from it. The conclusion was that he was untouchable, that the world needed him more than it feared him, that chemical weapons were a tool he could reach for. This was not a paranoid misreading of his situation. It was a rational interpretation of 8 years of Western and Soviet support, delivered despite everything he had done. He had used chemical weapons against Iranian soldiers. The world noted it and kept selling. He had used chemical weapons against his own Kurdish population. The world noted it and kept selling. What lesson was available to him other than the lesson he drew? In August of 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. He had calculated, based in part on the experience of the previous 8 years, that the world would not respond with force. He had calculated that the United States was still, fundamentally, more concerned with Iran than with him. He had miscalculated, but the misread was not insane. It was built on the specific history of a man who had been supported, tolerated, and armed through the worst acts of his career. The Gulf War of 1991 removed him from Kuwait. It left him in power in Iraq for another 12 years. The Second Gulf War, begun in March of 2003, cited weapons of mass destruction as its primary justification. The weapons programs that were cited, chemical, biological, the claims of nuclear ambition, were the direct legacy of the programs that had been developed, with Western assistance, during the Iran-Iraq War. The war that no one remembered had seeded the war that everyone does. 8 years, 1 million people, or close to it. No border changed. No political system fell. No grand strategic objective was achieved by either side. The Shadow Arab dispute that began the war was not resolved by the war. It would not be resolved until the Algiers Agreement of 2007, 27 years, after the first shots were fired in the form of a joint mission that simply agreed to maintain the status quo. The status quo that had existed before the 22nd of September, 1980. That is the story of the Iran-Iraq War in its most reduced form. Two countries fought for 8 years. 1 million people died. And when it was over, the world was exactly as it had been, except for the 1 million people. They were gone. And the world very quietly, very deliberately chose not to notice. That choice had consequences. It always does. If this story raised one question above all others, it may be this one. How did Saddam Hussein hold Iraq together through 8 years of a war that killed hundreds of thousands of his own people, exhausted his treasury, and ended without a single gain? The answer to that question lives inside another story, the story of the Anfal campaign, the systematic destruction of Kurdish Iraq that ran in parallel with the final years of this war, and what it tells us about how totalitarian systems survive what should destroy them. That story is on this channel. If you want to understand how this war produced the world it produced, subscribe. There is more here than most history will tell you.